Alexander the Great, conqueror, hero, legend, but did you know he was also a notorious drunk? This guy wasn't just building an empire, he was also making some pretty destructive decisions, like killing one of his closest friends in a drunken rage. Curious? There's a lot more to the story than you learned in school. Stick around as you dive into the wild side of history's greatest drunk. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. From the get-go, it seemed like he was destined for greatness. His dad, King Philip II, was this incredible military strategist who managed to unite all the Greek city-states under his rule. But honestly, a lot of Alexander's ambition came from his mom, Olympias. She was a strong believer that her son was destined for greatness, even claiming that he was descended from Achilles. Talk about pressure. Then there's Aristotle, his famous teacher. Yeah, the Aristotle. For a few key years, he taught Alexander philosophy and science, but soon enough, Alexander was learning the art of war firsthand, under his father's guidance, and on the battlefield. Fast forward a few years, Alexander's dad gets assassinated, and boom, just at 20 years old, Alexander takes the throne, and he wastes no time getting to work. He decides he's going to do what his father couldn't, take down the massive Persian Empire. Alexander's early battles like at Granicus and Issus was where he really made a name for himself. They weren't just fights, they were like well-crafted theater performances meant to show the world that Alexander was no ordinary king. He was destined by the gods to rule. Speaking of destiny, Alexander was a master at building his own legend. Remember the story of the Gordian knot? This knot was supposedly impossible to untie, and whoever could solve it would rule all of Asia. Most people would have given up, but not Alexander. According to the myth, he just sliced right through it with his sword. To his followers, this wasn't just smart thinking, it was proof that he was truly meant to conquer. But here's the thing, with every victory, Alexander became more convinced of his own invincibility. He began to see himself not just as a king, but almost like a god. And while that confidence helped him push his empire's boundaries further than anyone thought possible, it also planted the seeds of his downfall. And that's where things start to get really interesting and a little dark. Hey, before we delve into Alexander's dark side, consider subscribing, it helps me keep going. So we know Alexander was great at conquering, but he was also pretty great at partying. Maybe a little too great. Banquets were a huge part of Macedonian life, where everybody bonded over wine. But for Alexander, these parties often took a dangerous turn. Now it's said that Alexander's drinking was excessive, even by the standards of his time. Historian Hugh Bowden mentions that while drinking was normal for Macedonians, Alexander often went overboard, and when he did, things could get ugly. One of the most infamous stories about Alexander is from 328 BC at a banquet in Maracanda. After a lot of drinking, Alexander got into a heated argument with one of his closest friends, Cletus the Black. Cletus wasn't just any friend, he had saved Alexander's life in battle. But that night, fueled by alcohol, Alexander accused Cletus of disrespecting him. This argument escalated until, in a drunken rage, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed Cletus on the spot. After Alexander turned his friend into a kebab, the whole room went dead silent. Historian Bosworth describes this as a turning point for Alexander. He wasn't just a leader anymore. This act of violence showed just how destructive his darker impulses could be. Alexander was devastated by what he'd done. He spent days in mourning, refusing to eat or drink, and kept calling out for Cletus. But here's the thing, this wasn't an isolated incident. Alexander's relationship with alcohol didn't just lead to personal tragedies, it had wider effects on his leadership. One of the most controversial moments of his career was the burning of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. Historian Peter Green points out that this wasn't a strategic military decision, Instead, it was a reckless act spurred by alcohol and egged on by those around him. Boys will be boys, am I right? Even Alexander's own men were shocked by the destruction. It was a huge turning point in how people saw him, both during his time and in the years to come. As the campaigns dragged on, Alexander's drinking and erratic behavior started to take a toll on his relationships with those around him. Historian Evan Worthington notes that Alexander became increasingly paranoid, punishing anyone he suspected of disloyalty. Behind closed doors, his generals began to question his judgment. The guy they'd followed across continents was becoming more and more unpredictable. His choices were shaped just as much by the wine he drank as by his military genius. At this point, the cracks were starting to show. The man who once seemed like a god was showing his human side, and it wasn't pretty. By the time Alexander's empire was at its peak, the man himself was starting to unravel. The murder of Cletus, the burning of Persepolis, and his increasingly erratic behavior were all signs that something was seriously wrong. As he pushed his army further into unknown territories, the flaws in his leadership became harder to ignore. His drinking wasn't just a personal problem anymore, it was affecting the entire empire. Ancient historians like Plutarch have pointed out that in his later years, Alexander's reliance on alcohol and his unpredictable behavior started to alienate his closest companions. The unity that held his empire together was starting to fray. Robin Lane Fox, another historian, notes that Alexander's personal flaws like his temper and growing paranoia began to chip away at the loyalty of his men, and with his drinking making things worse, the tension within his ranks kept building. In June 323 BC, Alexander fell ill in Babylon and died a few days later at the age of 32. We still don't know for sure what killed him. Maybe it was a fever, maybe poisoning, or maybe the toll of his lifestyle. But one thing's clear, his empire was left leaderless and vulnerable. Without Alexander's charismatic leadership, the empire he built quickly began to fall apart. His generals, known as the Didachi, couldn't agree on how to divide the spoils, and soon they were at each other's throats. The unity Alexander had fought so hard to create was gone almost overnight. Despite all that, Alexander's legacy lived on, though it's complicated. Historian Pierre Bryant talks about how, while Alexander's military genius and cultural influence are undeniable, his personal failings, especially his drinking and paranoia, played a big role in the instability that followed his death. At the end of the day, Alexander the Great isn't just remembered for his incredible military achievements, he's also remembered for the human flaws that led to his undoing. His legacy is a complex mix of triumph and tragedy, showing us that even the greatest figures in history aren't immune to the weaknesses that define us all. So, conquer the world if you can, but remember, drink responsibly. Hey, check out my other video, it covers why the ancient philosophers Pythagoras and Plato loved triangles. Turns out, triangles can explain everything.